They waved their Union Jacks. They cheered and they sang. They smiled and he smiled back. Downing Street, Friday, May the 2nd, 1997. After 18 years in opposition, Labour is coming home to power.
Here's to us.
To us.
Next stop, Belgrade. I feel proud to be a member of the Labour Party.
What motivated us to maintain the resolve of the alliance was our values: freedom, justice, compassion, basic human decency.
You can't believe a word you're told. That's another thing about war. They just lie. Truth is the first casualty of war. Indeed, truth never gets a look in during a war because you have to whip up public opinion to the point that they support what's being done. Those are the letters in favour of the war. Some of them sort of vaguely insulting. And these were the ones against the war. Thousands and thousands and thousands of them. I haven't counted them all, but there must be 5,000 or 6,000 there, I should think. And they poured in right through. And of course they gave me a lot of extremely useful information.
Who else is going to stop the killing? Oxfam? CND? The Dalai Lama? Gotta go in hard sometimes, sort it out. Just once, why can't we be on the winning side? Always back the losers? Is that our duty? The miners, the bloody Sandinistas, those wankers and their tree protests, Scampy, whatever his name was.
I mean, we came in after 18 years with a promise of this brave new world where we would have dialogue. You know, we all believe in the United Nations, and our expectations were pretty high when we had somebody like Robin Cook, who of course has stood against armed intervention, the use of nuclear weapons, as a means of resolving anything for most of his political life. So you can imagine that some of us are fairly traumatised by the turn of events.
Launch.
Missile away!
It shows that the so-called ethical foreign policy is in tatters. I think it's possibly the worst thing and worst decision both to bomb Iraq and to bomb Yugoslavia that any Labour government, certainly in my lifetime, has made.
Without the media coverage and the manipulation of the media, people would have seen through it much sooner, but they weren't allowed to. And the media went along with it too. We're very much a medieval system where the court scribblers hover around the king and report everything he thinks and ignore the peasants who are revolting. And that is why an alternative media, the sort of thing you do, and the pamphlets and magazines and the internet are so important.
I've been a journalist for many years, and I've reported a number of wars, and I've seen what bombs do when they're dropped on people who are defenseless. And when I pick up the paper this morning and read a major story that says that Mr. Hugh Edwards is to affront the new BBC News, has been tutored by 2 image consultants, has been advised to wear pinks, lavender and blues, and to avoid orange or purple or black, that he will sit in a studio that will have ivory walls and red carpet, and yellow and orange titles will show up. But most of all, the programme's new remit follows an 18 months, £200,000 review which concluded last year that viewers felt that their relationship with BBC News was child and parent rather than adult to adult.
BBC News.
We're not bombing civilians anyway, we're degrading their military machine.
Oh, like the TV station.
Propaganda's part of their war game.
And because they refuse to show 6 hours of the BBC every day, we bomb the hell out of them, right?
What has happened to the pride of people? Why aren't they speaking out? Why wasn't everyone who worked at the BBC striking on the day they killed camera people, young camera operators, makeup ladies, apprentices serving the tea and coffee in the Yugoslav TV headquarters? 30-odd people were slaughtered. Why wasn't the BBC convulsed by an opposition among its trade unionists, among its presenters, among its journalists, in solidarity, in grief and in anger about that outrageous action?
The power of the government machine and the Labour Party machine is such that if a journalist doesn't print the story they want, or prints the story they don't want, they go to the editor and say, why did you put him on? He's got his own agenda. And journalists are terrified that if they say something that isn't acceptable to the powers that be, they might lose their jobs. Editors are frightened. Proprietors are pressed.
You know, there's been a complete clampdown on independent thinking within the Labour Party, and I think that's part of it. If the leadership says it's okay for a war, it must be okay for a war. You're not going to get out of line. You're not going to get promoted. You're going to lose your job, etc. You won't get selected for a constituency. And then I think on the genuine side, I do think that people have been encouraged to think that the Serbs are a kind of uniquely evil force in Europe, a kind of new Nazism. And then how do you deal with the uniquely evil force? You've got to hit it from at the beginning. And I think people ought to have gone with that, because it's not just now, but throughout this Balkans business, we've had a whole stream of highly anti-Serbian views presented as normal. I've no brief for Milosevic, but if you compare him with Tudjman, they might as well be twin brothers for what they've done. The cruelties, the ethnic cleansing, all those things. You never hear about Tudjman. Nobody says Tudjman might be a war criminal.
One of the major PR companies in the United States actually set out to make the Serbs look like Nazis, and they admitted it. They've said that the key to doing that was to use Holocaust images in terms of the war in Bosnia, and then portray that onto the Serbs. Holocaust images of trains, of barbed wire, of displaced people, were beamed across America, and the Jewish community in America reacted as they would. I mean, anyone who remembers the Holocaust is a very powerful thing, and people are vehemently against something like that. So if you can create the image of the Serbs being the Nazis and everyone else being the Democrats, then you have won the media war and the bombs follow.
It's a very, very subtle system of control. It doesn't work by accident. And there's a daily briefing given at 11 o'clock in the number 10, and then another one in the afternoon at 4 o'clock at the House of Commons. And then the lobby correspondents don't come to the House now. They're so busy hovering around the so-called seats of power and pumping out what they're required to. And in the end, you know, that does begin to get, well, it becomes clear to people. A lot of Labour MPs are very, very unhappy about what's happening, but they don't speak in case they are prevented from standing again.
I think Claire Short's
description of Labour MPs and others like myself who've been active in the anti-war movement as akin to those who were appeasing Hitler is one of the most disgusting and vile remarks to come out of this new Labour government. I can only say that Claire is filled with self-hatred for what she's being forced to do by this government, but instead of turning the hatred on herself and the government and the countries which are reducing that part of the world to a rubble, she attacks those who are attacking it.
Earlier this evening, the playwright Harold Pinter was given half an hour on BBC Two to make the case against the war. And, lest the government accuse it of bias, the BBC has, in its ineffable wisdom, decided to present a counter to the counterblast. It's the Foreign Office Minister, Tony Lloyd. But first, some of Pinter's argument. He begins among the ranks of journalists at the daily MOD briefing.
The Geneva Conventions Act states that civilians shall not be the object of an attack unless they take a direct part in hostilities. How can you then describe the killing of civilians in the Belgrade TV station as anything else than an act of murder?
I deny and refute that absolutely, completely. Mr. Pinter's obviously got a new occupation now, but I know his views. The fact is that...
Tony Lloyd, can you just deal with the first of Harold Pinter's points there? Why is the killing of a makeup artist in a television studio not murder?
Well, the killing of any civilian is just that. It must be a tragedy.
Hang on, they were targeted.
It's still a tragedy, Jeremy, and there's a huge difference between targeting facilities, which is what NATO has done to attack Milosevic's propaganda machine, to attack those things that help him to keep his ruthless war on the road.
It's a tragedy that we deliberately intended.
Casualties are not abstract concepts like truth. They're people, killed, maimed, displaced and terrified, who've lost their homes and lost their societies. Every day we see the tragic refugees from Kosovo, but we don't see much of the Serb civilians of Aleksinac and Belgrade and Novi Sad. These are NATO's victims. And if we lose sight of these people for a moment under the euphemisms of collateral damage, or what is amazingly called a humanitarian war, is to suspend critical judgment. This makes us become casualties ourselves, albeit of a completely different order.
Stop the bombing! End the war! Stop the bombing! End the war! 5, 3, 4! We don't want your bloody war! 5, 6, 7, 8! Standing on the welfare state! 1, 2, 3, 4! We don't want your bloody war! 5, 6, 7, 8! Standing on the welfare state!
I think we should rename the Ministry of Defence the Ministry of War, because they're not defending anyone. Tonight, in Belgrade, in Niš, in Novi Sad, in Pristina, in refugee camps in Macedonia, Albania, all over the region, there will be many who, like me, will have a young family. Tonight, I only have to worry about my children going to bed on time. I will not hear them screaming with fear through the night.
On their very own admission, those in charge of the war have been amazed by its three most obvious results so far. The huge numbers of refugees forced out of Kosovo by the Serb armed forces as soon as the bombing began. The reinforcement of President Milosevic's position inside the country, with much of his opposition rallying to him in the crisis, and the disastrous economic repercussions on all the neighbouring countries.
The bombing of Yugoslavia, as the Pentagon and the Defense Intelligence Agency had warned, they said, you bomb Yugoslavia and the automatic response will be to punish you and punish the people by throwing them out. And I know on good authority that this point was also made by the Czechoslovak representatives at a NATO Council meeting in the presence of Blair and Cook. So when Tony Blair and Robin Cook say, we didn't think he would do this, they are lying through their teeth.
This is not a battle for territory. This is a battle for humanity. It is a just cause. It is a rightful cause. And we will make sure that these people here are returned to their homes. And I hope the next time that we meet, it is as we meet going back across the border, into Kosovo.
But the greatest irony to a housekeeper like me is that we're so good at spending $2 billion a day on smashing the infrastructure in Serbia, and we can't build latrines for the people on the Macedonian border. We expect the people who deserve our help, whom we claim to want to protect, we expect the care of them to be financed out of people's spare cash, to be run by amateurs and charitable organizations, whereas our enormous technology and our professional elite is busy smashing the country to bits. Is this not a pretty good sign of what our real priorities are?
There are not that many places for them to hide. We're going to pin them down, close them out, and take them out. And we'll keep on hitting them until Milosevic faces up to the demands of the international community.
Laser precision, think of those two phrases, laser precision, Bulgaria. Now, call me a perfectionist.
This damage, if it does occur at all, is wholly unintentional, and that we are making every effort to strike military targets with the accuracy that you would expect from this alliance, and which is certainly making this air campaign by a long shot the most accurate use of air power and the most discriminatory use of air power in the history of human conflict.
The bombing that occurred from a very great height, 15,000 feet. It now turns out they only destroyed 13 Serb tanks. But I think they dropped more bombs on Yugoslavia than were dropped in the whole Second World War on Britain. And the high-tech warfare is a bit of a fraud. The Americans who had developed the stealth fighter, which wasn't visible on a television set, forgot that if you flew overhead you could actually see it, and one of them was shot down. So the whole high-tech war idea that you could have a war without casualties. Mind you, it is true that very few people were killed on the western side. That was because of the carpet bombing that went on. But it didn't destroy the Serb military, and the Serb military withdrew in good order from Kosovo. It wasn't a rout like the Iraqis who were running back from Basra, where they followed them up and just covered them in sand.
What also is censored is giving us any real understanding of the history of the war, the economic destruction of Yugoslavia, which goes back to the 1980s when the IMF, in its usual form, moved into Yugoslavia, and something like a quarter to a third of the workforce lost their jobs over a period of 2 years.
Or, well, if you go back to the very beginning, there's no doubt whatever that it was the strategy of the West to break up Yugoslavia. History is so important in this case. The Yugoslavia were occupied by the Turks, and they were occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then the Nazis went in, and there was a fascist Croatia. Serbia declared war on Germany when Russia and America were still neutral, played a very significant part in the winning of the war. Tito was backed by Churchill, so Tito became a hero of the West during the war and of the Allies. Then, when there was a break with Moscow in 1948, Tito became even more of a hero, and he was armed. Always fine, we armed everybody. But it represented a powerful and important outpost of a much more democratic form of socialism, which was totally unacceptable. And then they began some quite important economic reforms, trying to combine socialist planning with a degree of devolution of power. Then the IMF came in and put such a squeeze on them.
Socialist Yugoslavia was a successful economy, relatively, for the area. Now, 20 years ago, the US set out to destabilise and recolonise, to overthrow the communist parties and the governments. Now, the IMF was the tool that was used. IMF loans were used to demand economic reforms that effectively speeded up the collapse of the Yugoslav industry and dismantled the welfare state.
There's no doubt that the turn to nationalism came when the different parties, communist parties in the different regions felt that the only way they could secure their base in the factories was no longer by economic measures because of the IMF's ruling. The Austrians encouraged the Slovenes to break off. The Germans moved in and encouraged the Croats. Once this had happened, the Americans wanted their own base, so they made a protectorate in Bosnia. It's hardly surprising in the view of this that the Serbs turned to an extreme form of nationalism.
Genscher, the former German foreign minister, said when he retired that the breakup of Yugoslavia, the recognition of Croatia, was the great achievement of his period as German foreign minister.
Serbia was one of the only nations in the Balkans that refused to have NATO bases on its soil, and also it refused to privatise its economy.
Then undoubtedly they decided to remove Milosevic. Milosevic is an interesting case because he was a socialist, but like many socialists, when under pressure he turned nationalist, the same as happened in Russia. Happened all over the place. If you don't have an international perspective, then you go back to defending your own people.
I think this war was essentially a war waged for NATO. It was a war waged to help people accept the fact that NATO is going to change its character from what was essentially a defensive organization into a zapping organization, which can replace the UN and go and hit any target in the world where the United States feels that something it supports is threatened.
I did a television program with a guy called Sir Jeremy Mackenzie, who had been General Wesley Clark's deputy. He just retired when I did the program with him, and when we had the discussion, he said on the program that the war was planned by NATO in August of 1998. And then the Rambouillet so-called agreement was not an agreement, it was an ultimatum. They said to Milosevic, unless you allow NATO troops to occupy the whole of Yugoslavia, not just Kosovo, but the whole of Yugoslavia, we'll get a bomb mill.
Then we must stand in Kosovo for the elemental principle of the common humanity of every breathing, living person in this continent.
You could have had a UN peacekeeping force composed largely of non-NATO countries, which the Serbs would have accepted. But what the Serbs were presented with was a NATO occupation force in Kosovo, which had the right to inspect and go anywhere it liked in the whole of Serbia, i.e. basically an occupation force, and secondly, that no NATO soldier could be charged with crimes by any local authority. So that these were unacceptable conditions. Which country with even a tiny amount of self-respect would accept them? I think Blair's Britain probably would if the Americans wanted, but very few other countries would.
The NATO founding document itself, Article 7, says when NATO was founded and signed up 1949, that NATO will only act under the jurisdiction of the United Nations. Both from the NATO side and from the UN side, the action is illegal. Now, I think that actually when you come to killing people, law is quite important.
Where they couldn't force the government to privatise it, they have flattened it. Now, Serbia is not in a position to be able to rebuild that car plant. But BMW, or one of the transnational corporations, is set to move in to rebuild it and re-employ those workers under different circumstances. And also the threat of pulling out to Hungary or somewhere else if they don't comply to their needs. So in many ways, it's also the transnational corporations that will benefit.
Sick of this anti-Americanism for its own sake. If the Americans were involved, you're against it, a priori. But even if their intentions are questionable, they can still do good.
By accident,
Why not? Why? Of course they act out of self-interest, who doesn't? But if they can save lives, if they can get the refugees back home, who the hell are you to suggest they shouldn't?
Surely, if they can do it to Yugoslavia, and they can do it to Iraq, they can do it to Russia. In the German press, there's been quite reliable reports about how the Russians have moved back to a doctrine of first strike on their nuclear weapons along their western borders.
I think this story is by no means over. I think it's going to continue to haunt us for a long, long time to come. But even more, what is frightening is that NATO intends to make the Balkan War the launching pad for other wars. Brzezinski, who was security advisor to Reagan or Bush, has now said that if the Ukraine tried to rejoin Russia, that would be contrary to American national interest. And so the Russian fear throughout the Cold War that NATO was really aggressive has been proved to be right, that NATO is moving eastwards has proved to be right, Poland has been drawn in, and the Poles, who've got a lot of problems to cope with, are now going to be armed with American weapons, and the European Union will pay for it. The Americans, having bombed Yugoslavia, have now said that the European Union has got to pick up the pieces. They're not going to pay. So I think this is the beginning of a wholly new era in world politics, a return of imperialism.
I think the real strategic reasons are to establish US hegemony within Europe. I think ever since the European Union has been moving forward and it's got its own currency, the United States is slightly nervous. And I think one of the things that they have sabotaged consistently is any attempt by Europe to set up its own security organizations, which is what we were promised in Helsinki before the Berlin Wall came down. The Russians feel that they've been cheated, badly treated, humiliated, and betrayed. Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet leader who was in Britain this year, said, "I think NATO wanted a war."
The war against Yugoslavia was modern blitzkrieg. It was an attack on civilians. And there's too many examples of hospitals, schools, sanitariums, refugees being killed, hospitals, buses. Now these are not military targets. These are targets on civilians. But the collateral damage that was talked about was very real. And they targeted civilians, and they targeted the TV stations in Belgrade. They target transmitters to break the will of the Yugoslav people.
It's time that every thinking person in this country decided to join the movement to outlaw war and to study new ways of conflict resolution. Even if our bombs were smart, even if they hit what they were aimed at, even if we didn't kill innocent civilians, what we are doing now doesn't make sense. And I resent having to appear as a Democrat in a civilization that behaves in this imbecilic manner. This government does not represent me, it doesn't represent you, and it doesn't represent those people at home who are watching all of this in speechless grief and pain and incomprehension.
An empire that doesn't want to sacrifice its troops is an empire fighting for imperialism with one hand tied behind its back. I mean, if the Americans had sent thousands of troops into Kosovo, the situation would have been different, but they weren't prepared to do it. And I don't think the British would have been prepared to send troops in either. So had the ground war option been taken, I think the popular opposition to it would have been much stronger, so they confined themselves to the bombing. And the British military contribution was puny compared to the American. What was it? The Americans were responsible for 85% of all the bombing raids, and yet Britain presented itself as the great hawk. So the thing was a bit unreal, like a lot of public relations exercises.
The armed forces hold a special place in the hearts of most of the British population. There is a long-standing affinity between the community and the Army, Royal Navy and Royal Air Force. It has been traditional for British politicians to be seen in the company of smiling soldiers. This happens at Christmas time and at various other occasions throughout the year. And politicians like to, I suppose, be caught up in the slipstream of the success created by the army. It is particularly significant in this case that a Labour Prime Minister played such a prominent part in the Kosovo crisis. And one only has to think back to the 70s when I was in Northern Ireland when the security services, particularly the intelligence community, tried to destabilise the then Labour government, and how far the British Labour Party has moved since those years.
I think this is the most bellicose government, Labour government, we have ever had. During the Korean War, Britain did have troops, but I remember Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister, flying to Washington to stop the Americans using nuclear weapons. During the Vietnam War, Harold Wilson was under very, very heavy pressure to use troops, to send even a token British contingent to fight in Vietnam. He refused to do so. We criticized him for not breaking with the Americans, and we were right. But at least Wilson didn't send troops. If he had, the Labour government would probably have split. But this Labour government is something new. On a political front, it has broken with old Labour-style social democracy.
What is happening now is that an illegal war is being followed by war crimes. To bomb the Chinese embassy and kill diplomats, to bomb the hospital yesterday, use bombs in the market, cluster bombs, to bomb the television station, to bomb refugees, to bomb people on a bridge, in a bus. These are war crimes. And I never thought in my life that I would see a government which I support engaged in war crimes.
I don't think that this is a just war on the basis of any Christian theology or morality. In fact, the Pope, who's not a person I normally support, issued an appeal. The Pope's Easter message this Easter was totally blacked out by the media in this country, which has never happened before. And why? Because the Pope came out and said NATO's war against Yugoslavia is a diabolical act of retribution. Now, for the Pope to use words like diabolical when politicians are saying it's a just war is very interesting.
Ne znam, ovo je neopisivo, stvarno, verujte. Ovo ne može, samo da doživi neko, pa onda može da...
Stop the bombing! End the war! 1, 2, 3, 4! We don't want your bloody war! 5, 6, 7, 8! Send it on the welfare state! 1, 2, 3, 4! We don't want your bloody war! 5, 6, 7, 8! Spend it on the welfare state!
Whose set of priorities is this? Did any of us vote for this? No. And what is this rubbish about defense? Defense is a lie. We only have attack and counterattack. We have retaliation. That's all we have to offer. What's actually going on in Serbia is a punishment beating.
I think lots of people on the left are supporting this war, are doing it for various reasons. Some want Milosevic punished for what the Serbs did in Bosnia. Lots of people you talk to saying, but remember Srebrenica? I remember Srebrenica. It was awful, vile event. But to punish someone now for what happened then, it's all displaced. It's a displaced anger. Some want Milosevic punished for what happened in Rwanda. We didn't do anything then. So it's almost as if liberal and left guilt about previous things which were left unattended is now being poured in the shape of bombs onto the cities of the Yugoslav Federation.
I think they should have been aware that they were being subjected to a huge propaganda exercise, particularly when they brought in William Walker to head up the verification mission in Kosovo, the OSCE, and alarm bells should have rung immediately. This was the man who was in El Salvador, who was the apologist for the death squads, who was in Nicaragua, who helped the covert operations to fund the Contras. This is a CIA plant who does America's dirty work all over the world. And when he went to the so-called massacre at Račak, the Serbs never denied they'd had a shootout with the KLA in Račak, and many of the KLA soldiers were dead. They never denied that Serbs suffered their own casualties as well. And of course we know now from forensic evidence that that was no massacre. But Walker went immediately, denounced it as a massacre. Rambouillet ensued, and of course we got the ultimatum and the excuse to bomb. And I think the left, who've gone through all these years of watching this kind of nonsense, you know, happen, I think it's unforgivable that they walked into that trap.
Real negotiations for a political framework, taking time, patience and tolerance, will not, of course, be easily organised by either Mr. Milosevic or Mrs. Albright or our own European leaders. But within Serbia and within the Albanian community of Kosovo, there are people who will emerge as leaders of their own society, and they need no lessons in democracy from those of us in Western Europe who've been part of the destruction of their economy and their society for decades to come.
Oh, I think the commercial interests are very clear. First of all, a gateway to the Middle East through the Balkans. Remember, the Russians have discovered a lot of oil in the Caspian, and you've got to get that oil into Europe through a safe route, because you can't rely on Iran or Iraq to get it through. Then there is the fact of the natural resources of Kosovo, which are very, very rich in resources, which would be under the control of the West. Then you've got the rebuilding of Kosovo. You can be absolutely sure that all the construction companies will be queuing up now to get money from the Americans or the British or the Europeans who are going to rebuild Kosovo. Then they'll be queuing up also to get access to the rebuilding of Yugoslavia if Milosevic goes and the money is available. And the privatization is such that that's what it's about. Douglas Hurd, the former Conservative foreign minister, negotiated the privatization of the Yugoslav telecommunication system with Milosevic himself.
They've got the 5 countries surrounding Serbia, who of course are in terrible, terrible economic trouble. Macedonia, Bulgaria, countries like that. And they've got the Stability Pact, so-called Stability Pact going. They've just had a meeting where they're telling the Bulgarians, etc., that you've got to privatise, you know, and of course the big American businessmen and Western businessmen are waiting there with bags of money to take over all the public sector in these countries, and they're being told what to do.
If you look back over the history of this century, there have been 2 attempts at socialism. In the case of Russian communism, they were never able to establish a democratic base, and therefore when the thing cracked at the top, it cracked all the way down. Britain and America and France invaded Russia during the 30s. The British government supported Hitler against Russia. the war came and was a bit of an embarrassment. I think in many ways Western capital would have preferred to have Hitler on our side to destroy communism, but it didn't work out like that. In 1945, after the Japanese had offered to surrender, the atom bomb was dropped in order to tell Russia that the West had a weapon of supreme, or America had a weapon of supreme power. The Cold War was presented as a military threat to the West, when actually it was an ideological threat. What they were really afraid of was not that the Red Army would occupy London, but that socialist ideas would spread, and the Marshall Plan was designed to check the advance of socialism in a destroyed Western Europe, NATO to defend capitalism, the EEC to strengthen capitalism, and then when the collapse came, to move eastwards and mop it all up. And if you look at the American record in particular, the attempt to destroy Cuba, the occupation of Grenada, the bombing of Libya, the war against Iraq, this is a search and destroy mission that's taking place all over the world in order to make the world fit for capitalism. And the Social Democrats, if you look at their side of it, just abandoned socialism completely. I mean, if communism never found a democratic base, Social Democrats abandoned their socialism and are now the most powerful and passionate advocates of globalization, market forces, the World Trade Organization, the IMF and so on. That's what's really happening.
Haven't you noticed? Britain's leading this war. I feel proud to be a member of the Labour Party.
You'll be let down and then you'll scream betrayal.
But we've spent a lifetime knocking our own values. Socialism's dead, Leonie. The project failed, but I'm glad. I feel so much better.
Cleansed.
Yes! We were always against things, carping on the sidelines forever, whinging on about how even our left-wing leaders weren't left-wing enough. Well, those days are over, thank God. There's only one game in town and we're part of it, at least I am. Join me.
No.
Let's go upstairs.
No.
Consummate the new order.
One of the things that you can do, and it's a difficult job, but it can be done, is this, to encourage people to think again about recent history, because the media tell you what to think today. In 25 years' time, the historians perform their historic function of distorting history forever. But between today and 25 years is a period within people's experience which they remember. They remember what they were told to think, and you can encourage them to rethink. I mean, we lived in a feudal system and then a capitalist system for hundreds of years before people decided to do something about it because they didn't know. The means of mass communication are a bit better now. I think the internet and what you're doing with this film indicates there is a chance of changing it, but it's always a struggle to beat the powerful who control the sound waves and the printing machines. It's a hell of a struggle. I mean, I'm not pretending it's quick.
At exactly 1 o'clock New York time, cue given by NATO and the White House, the United Nations Security Council, largely ignored for 11 weeks of war, met to sign off on the peace. Only China abstained. And as always here, all sides were given the floor to present their case to the world.